Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a beautifully crafted classic by Gregorio Lopez y Fuentes that asks some really profound questions about the human spirit. We'll be breaking down A Letter to God, blending our narrative analysis with the ultimate study guide to help you absolutely crush your CBSE Class 10 English exams.
So, have you ever just hoped for a miracle? I mean, can faith literally move mountains? And maybe the more interesting question is, what happens when an act of incredible human kindness ends up being completely misunderstood? We're going to unpack all of this by looking at the dramatic story of a farmer with some truly unshakable faith.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the storm in the crop, take a close look at that famous letter to God, unpack the ironic twist ending, decode the core themes and metaphors, and finally, go over the common mistakes you absolutely have to avoid on test day.
All right, Section 1, The Storm and the Crop. A farmer's hope turns to despair. We start by meeting our protagonist, Lencho. He's this incredibly hardworking, innocent farmer living in a solitary house right on top of a hill. Lencho's entire livelihood, his ability to feed his family for the whole upcoming year, depends entirely on his ripe cornfields getting a solid downpour of rain.
The author uses some amazing visual metaphors here to set the scene. When the rain finally hits, Lencho is thrilled. He literally sees the raindrops as new coins, 10-cent pieces and fives, because they represent real prosperity and wealth for his family. He looks up at the approaching clouds and describes them as huge mountains, which really emphasizes how massive and imposing they are. But then, those new coins turn into hailstones, which are perfectly described as frozen pearls, capturing their icy, destructive beauty.
And man, the timeline of events turns tragic real fast. What starts as a morning of high hopes turns into reality when the rain begins at mealtime. But then, out of nowhere, a strong wind blows in. That hopeful rain transforms into an hour-long barrage of those frozen pearls. The hailstorm completely destroys his crop. It washes away all the flowers, leaving Lencho completely devastated, knowing there's nothing left to feed his family.
Which brings us to Section 2, A Letter Addressed to God, Unshakable Faith in the Face of Ruin.
Because after losing absolutely everything, who do you turn to? For Lencho, the answer was obvious. He turns to God. Lencho had this rock-solid, unquestioning faith. He'd been taught that God's eyes see everything, even the depths of one's conscience. So with total innocence, he literally sits down and writes a letter addressed directly to the Almighty, laying out his desperate situation. And he doesn't just ask for some vague sort of help, he asks for exactly 100 pesos. He calculated that this was the precise amount he needed to sow his field again and just survive until the next crop came in. He puts it in an envelope, writes "to God" on the outside, and drops it right in the mail.
Now, enter the postmaster. He's a really kind, generous guy. When he first reads the letter, he cracks up laughing, naturally. But that laughter quickly turns into deep admiration. He is so moved by the sheer conviction of Lencho's faith that he decides he can't let it be broken. So he comes up with this beautiful, selfless plan. He secretly collects money from his colleagues, chips in some of his own salary, and gets enough to help this desperate farmer.
And that incredible act of compassion sets up Section 3, the ironic twist ending, when expectations clash with reality.
The postmaster signs the envelope simply as God and sends it back. When Lencho receives it, he opens it with zero surprise. Seriously, his faith is that strong. He fully expected God to reply. But that immense relief instantly turns to pure fury. He counts the cash and finds only 70 pesos instead of the 100 he demanded. In Lencho's mind, God doesn't make math mistakes, and God definitely wouldn't deny his request.
And here's where the massive tragic misunderstanding happens. Lencho immediately fires off a second letter to God asking for the rest of the money. But he specifically tells God not to send it through the mail. Why? Because in Lencho's reality, the post office workers are a bunch of crooks who obviously stole the missing 30 pesos. He has absolutely no idea that in actual reality, these very workers are his selfless benefactors. It is just a textbook, brilliant example of dramatic irony.
Let's pivot to the analytical side of things with Section 4, Core Themes and Metaphors, Decoding the Literary Devices.
To really master this chapter, you can think of the story as resting on 4 foundational pillars. First, there's Lencho's pure, unshakable faith in God. Second, his hope and resilience when facing total ruin. Third, the unrewarded human kindness of the post office staff. And finally, the brilliant use of irony and innocence, showing how blind belief can sometimes lead you to completely misunderstand the good people around you.
You also want to make sure you deeply understand the dual conflicts driving this narrative. You've got the physical battle, humans versus nature, which is perfectly illustrated by the hailstorm wiping out the crops. But you've also got this psychological conflict, humans versus humans. Lencho mistrusts the very people who sacrifice their own money to save him, which really suggests that people often lack faith in their fellow human beings.
Oh, and a quick tip for your NCERT language comprehension checks. Brush up on that storm vocabulary. The text highlights different destructive forces of nature. Make sure you know the difference between a cyclone moving in a circle, a gale, which is just an extremely strong wind, and a typhoon, which is a violent tropical storm. Trust me, the exact wording really matters for those short answer questions.
All right, let's wrap up with Section 5, Avoiding Common Exam Mistakes, How to Secure Your Board Exam Marks.
As an exam coach, let me tell you the biggest trap to avoid. When you write your answers, do not describe Lencho as foolish, stupid, or ungrateful. That is a major pitfall. Instead, focus heavily on his absolute innocence and his naive faith. Second, always give credit to the postmaster's selflessness. If your answer only talks about Lencho, it's incomplete. And finally, don't just say the theme is faith, talk about human kindness. And be sure to use the exact literary term, dramatic irony, to really impress the examiner.
In fact, for those long-form questions, you want to explicitly state that the dramatic irony happens precisely because the good deed went unrecognized. We, the readers, know the post office employees sent the cash, but Lencho fully believes it was from God, which leads him to literally label his own saviors as crooks.
I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. True kindness doesn't ask for recognition, right? But put yourself in those shoes for a second. If you had just sacrificed a chunk of your own hard-earned salary to help a total stranger in a desperate situation, how would you feel reading a letter where you're called a crook by the very person you saved? It's a pretty fascinating look at human nature. Thanks for hanging out with us for this explainer, and good luck with your studies.